The enchant mechanic in prod is one of the most interesting things prod has to offer to the RPG community as a whole. And I just feel like it is just so misused. I feel it could be done a lot better, and with a couple tweaks and reworks of how the enchant system works, I feel like prod would benefit a lot from reworking the way enchants are in the main game. Now, I've already said that the enchant system is one of the most misused mechanics in the entire game, and the reasons for that is just the buff zones are not needed. They are a complete inconvenience to the player. I'll go into that a little more in a bit. The rarity that you get in chance is just insane. A 10% chance every 30 minutes is just wow. 10% every 30 minutes. I also want to talk about some of the enchants are just really overpowered, and then some of them just aren't. There is no real balance between them, and that's sort of just why exactly is this? I never understood that, and we'll go into that a little bit as well. But to go back to the buff zones are completely useless. Buff zones are just an inconvenience to the player. And I know why they exist, but there are so many better ways to go about it. And the most logical reason I can see for buff zones to exist is because they realized damage enchants didn't do anything and they were completely useless. Before you get to buff zones, you can completely rely on your sword's damage to get UI. But the devs realized this and they were like, we need to change this. We need to make it so that enchants can do stuff. Damage enchants, to be specific. So they created a zone that basically relies on your damage enchants. The problem with this is that nobody has damage enchants when they get to buff zones because nobody realizes they need them. So to follow up on the issue of the rareness of these enchants, the ideas I'm going to say later on in the video will make it so that we don't really need to change how rare the enchants are. Maybe just like raise it just a bit, but we can make the determination later on. With that being said though, I guess it's time to go into really what this video is going to be about, which is ideas of how to rework the enchant mechanic in the game to make it just a little more bearable and to make it actually fun. So, first idea is the idea of super bosses or the buffed bosses that I had. So, what if we got rid of buff zones? And that sounds kind of weird, but hear me out. I feel like making damage of a sword, the damage of a sword, completely irrelevant was the wrong move because it basically just gets rid of all the work you go through for getting any new sword really. After that, it's sort of just is the sword long, is the sword cool. So I feel like the devs should revert all of the buff zones into an actual just regular zone with regular enemies that are killable in a foreseeable amount of time with a regular sword. In doing this, it would bring back the use for regular swords, everyday swords, and make it so that you don't really need to rely on enchants to move on in the game, and you can just go on as if nothing ever happened. But here's where enchants come in. Here's where damage enchants come in. We take the prod swords and the fabled sword bosses, and we put them into like secret locations, right? Around the map. So for Sugar Rush, you would take Gel Demon, and we would take the Gingerbread Man, I forget his name, and then just put them in secret locations, or just keep them there. And then we put Buffed Boss as like the little title for them, and they stay the same. So in order to kill them, you need to have enchants. In fact, maybe this would work better with just only fabled enemies. Prod enemies can be killed regularly. So you're still getting prod swords, but fabled swords, you need to have an enchant. And those would be your buffed bosses. Those would be enemies that have a ridiculous amount of health and basically need to be killed by means of enchant. And the idea with it is that certain enemies would resist certain enchants. So to get Genji's Wrath for the gingerbread guy, he would resist like, I don't know, freeze maybe. Um, he would resist um, burn. He would resist just basically a lot of stuff and have like only one weakness. And in that, you would need to get that specific enchant in order to actually kill the boss. I feel like that would also bring want to get certain enchants so that you can actually kill these buffed bosses. But it's not so overbearing that in order to move on in the game, you need to have enchants. It's more of a if you want to get this sword in the game, you need to have enchants. So, in short, you revert all the buff zones back to regular zones. Just regular zones. You can kill enemies with relative ease with regular swords, right? But you have all the fabled sword enemies as buffed bosses that are just in some sort of secret location and can only be killed by means of enchant. Basically, just a buffed enemy. This would, like I said, bring back the use for damage enchants while not pressuring the player to actually get damage enchants. The next thing I want to talk about is actually getting enchants. The enchants are really rare to get. Like I said, 10% chance every 30 minutes. That is crazy. So I have an idea as to how to make that just a bit easier or make it feel like it's just a bit easier while at the same time having a bit of level control. So you see all these people running around with like at like level, and I can say it because I was this level like 15,000, 20,000, 30,000 major league levels, right? And we will tie this in with the enchants in just a moment. What if we made it so that once you reach the Southern Gate, we have a new type of revival? We could call these spirit revivals, or like some sort of mystic revival. And these revivals would cost like 1,000 levels to revive. And every time you did a revival like this, you would get something called a spirit token. Now, the reason why this is important is because we can now make a shop that sells any level 1 enchant for spirit tokens, which would make the player want to gain levels, but they wouldn't get over leveled, if that makes sense. They wouldn't become level 30,000, and just keep leveling up with no incentive for leveling up. So it would incentivize people to level up, and it would make it so that enchants are just a bit easier to get. And also, it would be a really cool way of just implementing the enchant system. And of course, the shop would only be in the Southern Gate, so you would need to get to the Southern Gate, get to Rev 100, regular Rev 100, to actually make it to the Southern Gate. And of course, this new type of revival would be a separate revival from the actual revival system. So you could go on infinitely with these spirit revivals unless there's more to be added in the game. So to put that into just a little basket, you have spirit revivals, which you get after getting to level 1000 and using revival, to get a spirit token, which can be used at a special shop in the Southern Gate that sells level 1 enchants of every kind. Now, one last thing about enchants that I think could be fixed. is freeze. Freeze, I think, should do damage. One, because I feel like you could tie that in with some buffed bosses in the future. But two, also, is why doesn't it do damage exactly? I mean, we have like one other enchant, which is paralysis, that sort of freezes the enemy and also does damage. I don't know why it doesn't do damage though. I'm sure there's a, you know, logical um, explanation for this, but I mean, unless, it's like, oh, we just can't, then I don't really see why it shouldn't do damage. It's sort of just a useless enchant that honestly just doesn't need to exist. But anyway, that's how I feel about enchants and how to fix them. Uh, of course, we can elaborate on this and or fix it up in case there's anything I said that was a little unfair, wrong. Um, but all in all, I feel like this is the way to go for fixing up the enchant system. I feel like this would definitely be a step in the right direction because make it doesn't make getting enchants too easy, but at the same time, it doesn't make it impossibly hard. And with the buffed bosses, it doesn't make it so that enchants or damage enchants are useless. It just makes it so that, you know, they're not as overbearing as buff zones were. And of course, if you ever like wanted to have a buffed zone, like much later into the game, when enchants are already being flown around the people, then sure. But as of right now, nobody has the enchant capacity to move on, which is probably why they're leaving the game. But anyways, that's how I feel. We'll see what happens with this. Again, we can talk about it whenever. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one.